All right. It's 6 o'clock here in Finland. It's 5 o'clock in the Central Europe. So welcome. It is European Fertility Week, and we are happy to have you all as our guests for this webinar arranged by Fertility Europe with the title Navigating My Choices in Gamete Donation. My name is Satu, and I will be the moderator of the webinar. This will be an insightful event where patients and experts will share their experiences and knowledge on gamete donation, exploring key challenges, solutions, and the future of reproductive medicine. Our program today includes 6 interesting and inspiring speakers. First, Anita is talking about gamete donation policies in Europe based on Atlas map findings. Then Nina talks about telling and talking, donor conception with children. Debbie is going to tell us about the end of donor anonymity in the era of DNA testing. And Jackson is following with the topic of the cap on the number of families created thanks to one donor. Majay is giving us an insight to the experience of being a parent through donation. And then Monica will take us through the patient survey done by Fertility Europe this autumn, and to which many of infertility patients around Europe replied. After the presentations, we will have place for questions and answers. Two important things about this webinar. It will be recorded and available afterwards on Fertility Europe's YouTube channel. Also, the presentations will be available afterwards. And about the Q&A, you can write your questions to the speakers in the Q&A section throughout the webinar. However, please always write at the beginning of your question which speaker you want to address it to. And now, let's get on with the presentations. Our first speaker is Fertility Europe's very own advocacy manager, Anita. She will go through the legal settings of donations in Europe. Anita, please go ahead. I'll just stop sharing here.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share. It's my screen, all right?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you very much for this introduction, Satu, and thank you very much for Fertility Europe for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and talk about the very complicated setting for a very complicated treatment that gamete donation is. So I start from... slides to change. Yes. So I start from little introduction of Fertility Europe. We are Patient Umbrella Association. This year we're celebrating 15 years. We are representing at the moment 33 member associations from 28 European countries. We work with many associations. We are official patient partner of ESHRE, we member of IFFS and European Patient Forum. We work with many European organizations on the Coalition for Fertility. We have several projects that have been running for years, like this European Fertility Week, which this year we're having the 9th edition of it. We have another flagship project advocating for education for young people at schools called FACTS. And we have so many more plans. So today we'll be talking about, as like I said, very complicated, very complex issue of gamete and embryo donation, but let's start from what it is. So gamete donation means that it's using eggs, sperm or embryos from someone else to help intended parents to have children. Intended parents being the term for person or people who will be bringing up the child. And who needs gamete and embryo donation? This could be heterosexual couples that are affected by infertility. They could be same-sex couples. That could be single parents by choice, individuals with genetic conditions, also people who are affected by medical problem that affects their fertility, or treatment to this medical problem that can affect their fertility, and also with women with early menopause. So we'll give you a little overview of the European policies regulating fertility treatment. This is the map. This is the project that we've created with European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. It is in those beautiful traffic light colors, illustrating the quality of policies regulating access to fertility treatment, with the aim being to advocate that safe, efficient, and fertility treatment is accessible for all who need it. And I would like to add here, one of the organizations that we hugely admire and that started to work with us recently is UNFPA, said in their State of Population of 2023 that we advocate for the world where each individual is free to choose their reproductive future. A world in which countries build demographic resilience by adapting to population change rather than attempting to control it. These words are very important in the way that the world is developing, both Europe, Americas. And we need to remember that in the world where we created a situation where women want to have children later, and people decide to postpone parenthood, and people are affected by environmental factors, and their fertility is. Donation is big part of our having children plans, and it will be only bigger. So we need to take it seriously. So what are the key findings from this fertility atlas and the policies? We can see that we focus on those affecting the gamete and embryo donation most. So we can see that from assessed 49 countries, only 22 of them have donor register. Let's say differently, 27 of them don't have donor register. We'll hear more later from other speakers why this is important, but and why possibly we could think about the world register, or at least European register. But at the moment, we don't even have the national registers of donors. In terms of access to treatment, yes, most countries, 45 out of 49, provide legally treatment with sperm donation for heterosexual couples. And 41 countries provide this possibility with egg donation for heterosexual couples. But if you look at the other groups, like female couples, only 21 countries provide possibility of treatment with sperm donation for them. Without this, obviously, the treatment is not possible. The same with the treatment for single women, 37 countries. So many of them don't even see the possibility, legal possibility for big groups of people to have children. And in terms of other regulations, donations, there is the, again, issue that we're going to hear more about it later from other speakers, but there is huge need for the information that the children conceive thanks to donation, that they know about their genetic origins. There's plenty of reasons for that, but the main one being it just breaks the human rights. So only 13 countries of those 49 provide the right to the information revealed to the children when they get to the certain age. And 12 countries offer the choice of mixed or anonymous or non-anonymous donation. So there is an option for the patients to their parents to choose what type of donation they go for. But this is still minority of the countries. Public funding is also very diverse and very complicated, and we'll hear again more why it should be better and how it would help build those resilient populations in Europe. And from the patient perspective, look, only 19 countries said that they listen to patient associations and consult them on public policies. There's so much complication and misinformation and around treatment and more so donation that no policymaker can actually get proper information without consulting the patient association. So we need more policymakers talking to patients to understand what needs to be done. And then we'll be talking, another issue is the psychological support and also implication counseling for people participating in gamete donation treatment. This is patients, this is donors, and this is children that are conceived thanks to the gamete donation. This is big issue that needs to be addressed. There are rules obviously about the screening, medical screening for donors. There's mostly from medical side, this is mostly agreed, although probably can be improved. There is a massive diversity in terms of compensation for donors. And in terms of looking after donors, there is also this implication counseling. And unfortunately, we have very good guidelines what this implication counseling should look like, but we don't really have information on practice, which means it's not happening very much. And coming back to the guidelines, this is the ESHRE recommendations for information that should be provided every time the gamete donation is performed. The information that donors, recipients, and offspring should be getting. And this is the checklist that's provided with this document should be on desk of in each clinic when the gamete donation is performed, should be also on the desk of each policymaker that regulates the donation, and it should be provided as a public information. So the decisions about donation are made without stigma, with the right information, and in a responsible way. And just one more thing, which again will be discussed more. Look at the regulations about the limits of children that can be born thanks to donation. If you start adding, there's quite a lot, and it's in Europe. That's only in Europe. There's a big argument where there should be European limits, world limits, and it should be discussed, and it's perhaps not being discussed enough. And I will finish here. Thank you very much. And I'll let other speakers have their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. I'm just trying to share my screen. Sorry about that. Do you see my screen now? Probably.
Yeah, I can see. That's Nina speaking.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I can see your screen introducing me.
Thank you. So thank you, Anita. The Atlas map really is a great advocacy tool for all of us and shows how diverse the legislations in Europe are. Our next speaker is Nina Barnsley. She is the director of the Donor Conception Network, a UK-based support organization for parents who have donor-conceived children and anyone considering donor conception as their route to parenthood. The charity was founded over 30 years ago, offering peer support to break the isolation many people feel when navigating a complex and often emotional journey. Nina has been leading the team at DCN for the last 10 years. She has a deep understanding of the particular issues that face families created through donor conception, and she regularly speaks and writes on the subject. So, Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen now. Great. Yes, so thank you very much to Fertility Europe for inviting me to talk in this webinar. So my presentation is on telling and talking about donor conception. And the reason for this topic really is because we know it's one of the reasons that prospective parents and indeed parents can feel anxious about this route to parenthood. For many people, it can even be a barrier to them choosing it because they can just think, do I have to be open about this? Am I going to have to talk about it? I don't feel comfortable talking about it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about why it's important to tell children, why it's sometimes difficult, and hopefully to give some suggestions on what can help. So the first question is it important to be open? So I think it's fair to say that 30 years ago, when the charity was founded, the general assumption was that it wasn't important, it didn't matter. And in fact, parents were generally advised not to be open with their children. But there were a group of families that felt that that wasn't right. They wanted to tell their children how they were conceived, and they came together, formed the charity, and offered each other support in that process. And I think part of the foundation of that decision that they made was that they felt that honesty was a better foundation, a healthier foundation for their family. They didn't want there to be this secret that was held back from the children. I think it's also true to say that they recognize that actually it's quite hard to hold a secret like that forever. You might start off feeling like, okay, we just won't talk about it. But very quickly, not talking about it turns into saying things that perhaps are not true, or at least are not the whole truth. And that can really feel quite uncomfortable to people. If they're asked a question about who the child looks like, or why a child might have a certain talent or something like that, that can be quite a tricky one to evade if you're not able to respond clearly around the fact that you've used a donor. And that can also place a bit of a psychological burden on parents, and that also didn't feel comfortable. I think there was also recognition that the information was not insignificant, so that there were ramifications for this in terms of medical history, in terms of the truth about that individual, that child, and where they came from, that was important information for them to have. And so it really respected donor-conceived people and donor-conceived children, and gave them the information that they needed in order to be confident that what they were saying about themselves was true. So over the years, as we've sort of seen the charity grow and we've supported more people, another element, I think, around openness has come to the fore, which is around helping parents actually process this decision. So by making people have to think about how they're going to talk about it and how they're going to share the information, how they're going to explain it, actually that process also helps parents to kind of come to terms with things if they're not feeling comfortable or not feeling completely confident. And so that has its own sort of beneficial effect, and just means that hopefully by the time children are aware of what the implications of this decision are, parents feel really ready, they feel really sort of solid in the family story, and they feel able to deal with questions that may come or situations that may arise, and their own emotional journey has been, they've helped themselves to kind of process that and manage that. Obviously, also being open, if people know what the situation is and if children know what the situation is, it's much easier to manage questions. And the truth is that questions do come. So in families, there's constant conversation around who looks like who and where certain traits come from. And it can be very difficult to know how to answer those sometimes without being evasive or actually outright lying, or certainly avoiding telling the whole truth. Whereas if you can say, oh, maybe that comes from the donor, or, oh, we don't know, she's donor conceived, so we don't have that answer. It's a much easier way to respond to a question, assuming, you know, parents have got to a point where they feel confident enough to say those things. So those are kind of the more positive and foundational reasons that we would put forward. But I think it's also true that the impact of home DNA testing has been really significant in the need for openness. So because home DNA testing is so popular and so many people have taken them, these tests, and they're matching with genetic family regularly. And so I think it's inconceivable that a child who's born today, or actually probably a child who's born in the last 20 or 30 years, would not at some point know whether or not the people they think of as their parents are actually their genetic parents. So they may not know whether the fact that they're donor conceived through one of these tests, but they will know that there's some kind of mystery, some kind of an anomaly in the family story, and they may wonder, you know, what it is and why they haven't been told about it. So I think that's just worth bearing in mind, and I know that Debbie's going to be talking a little bit about that later on in this webinar. But it does raise some questions. So once you start talking about the donor, they become a real person. They're not just a fiction in the shadows. And once they're a real person, they have to be integrated in some way into the family story. And that can feel quite uncomfortable. And that's part of the reason why sometimes it can feel really hard to talk about this. Very often, the route to parenthood has been quite an emotional journey for parents. So talking about it can bring up all of their feelings. And for many parents, not all, but for many parents, you know, choosing donor conception is not a first choice. And so they can feel slightly uncomfortable for themselves in this decision, and they can be a sense that that will transfer onto the child. You might be frightened, or people might be frightened about confusing or hurting a child with the information, and definitely there can be anxiety around maybe being rejected, that if a child knows that they're donor conceived, and that they then reject the parent that they're not genetically related to, or reject that side of the family. I think for parents, there's a real anxiety around being a real parent. And so that word real can come up a lot when the conversations that we have with our members and with people who contact us. And so that's another anxiety around talking about this, is if it's knowledge that people are aware of, will they treat us differently? Will our child treat us differently? There can also be practical reasons. So why not knowing how you're going to talk about this. So what you might even think, well, yes, I want to be open, but what does that actually mean? What am I going to say? When am I going to say it? How am I going to bring the subject up? How might my child respond? How might other people respond? And those kind of anxieties can also inhibit people and make it feel difficult. And finally, you know, for people who've got anonymous donors, there's always that fear at the back of the mind of that if there's no information to share, you know, will that just, by talking about this, does that just open a conversation that's going to lead to a dead end? So what can help with all of that? I think the first thing, the most important thing, like so many issues in life, is to make sure people have space, and have a space to go where they can explore their feelings, explore the thoughts they're having, their anxieties, and also think about whether and how and when they might be able to do it. So these things take time. One of the things we really try to do at the network here is not to put pressure on people. People have to go at their own pace. So these are gentle steps forward, and we're not rushing people. Talking to other people is always useful, and getting that peer support from other parents who've been there and done it. So parents who've talked to their children, hearing how they've responded, what words they used, what timing they chose, and what responses they had, can be incredibly confidence building. And of course, lots of resources available. DC Network has produced so many books. We produced the original book for children, and we've got other books as well. We run workshops. We've got lots of information on our website, and there are lots of other places to go. It's not just us. And just building that kind of suite of tools that can help parents is enormously valuable. And for the people who really do feel like, okay, they're really not sure, and it's bringing up a lot of complex emotions. Obviously, professional counselling can be really valuable too. So have a look on our website. I'm just a quick plug there to see it. Say lots of stuff on our website that can be very beneficial. Things like our books for children, books for adults. And so, yes, hopefully we can be helpful to anyone who's listening to the webinar and who's got some anxieties around telling and talking and being open. But thank you very much for listening this evening.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, Nina. This is an important issue about talking, telling and talking, and how to deal with it. So our next speaker, sorry, I might want to share my screen. Yeah, this is not working. Sorry about that. I think I have to stop, Nina, you from sharing, and then I can share myself. Okay, well, Debbie, I'll just let you share next.
Right.
I lost my presentation here, but thank you very much, Nina. And our third speaker is Debbie Kennett. Debbie is a well-known author and speaker and an internationally recognized expert on genetic genealogy. She is an honorary research fellow in the Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment at University College in London. She is the author of 2 books, and she has written widely about DNA testing, both for family history magazines and in academic journals. So your turn, Debbie.
Okay, so but the subject of my talk is how consumer DNA testing has effectively spelt the end of donor anonymity. Now, I first wrote about this subject back in 2016 with some colleagues from UCL when we were talking about how DNA testing was effectively ending donor anonymity. But in those days, DNA testing was still very much a niche occupation, and around about 3 million people around the world had taken a DNA test. And it was actually quite difficult finding examples to use in the paper of donor-conceived individuals who had been able to use DNA testing to identify their birth parent. There are only a handful of known examples. But fast forward to the present day, and we now have a number of DNA companies which have massive databases that allow people to be matched with their genetic relatives. Ancestry DNA is by far the largest, with a database of over 25 million people. 23andMe has a database of 15 million people, and there are a number of other smaller databases. There is some overlap because people do tend to test with a number of different companies, but there's certainly sort of 40 to 50 million people around the world who have taken one of these DNA tests. And what we're also seeing now is because there are so many success stories of people being able to use DNA testing to identify birth parents, we're seeing lots of programs on television. So in the UK, we have a program called Long Lost Family. They had a special not so long ago called Born from the Same Stranger, featuring donor-conceived people who had been able to use DNA testing to find the genetic parent. There's a program called DNA Family Secrets, which in one of their programs, they featured a donor who had taken a DNA test to try and connect with his donor children. And there are a number of Netflix documentaries where we've seen these super sperm donors, often doctors, fertility doctors, who've ended up using their own sperm and have produced these really massive families. So there's one Dr. Donald Klein in America who's thought to have perhaps 1,000 children, and another doctor in the Netherlands, again with a very, very large number of possible children. So that also, the fact that you have these programs, that also fuels an interest in DNA testing and makes people realize that they can use this as a method for identifying their birth parents. So what this means now is that anyone who is donor conceived, they can take a DNA test and they can try and search for their biological father or parents, depending on the form of conception. And the donors can, if they want, they can take a test and try and search for their offspring. And also we are seeing recipient parents testing to try and identify primarily half siblings, but also even just to identify the donor. And in some cases, the parents want to try and encourage a relationship with the child's half siblings. But we're also finding that donor origins can be revealed unexpectedly through genetic testing. And of course, in the early years, from say the 1940s onwards, parents were encouraged not to tell their child about that they were donor conceived. So this can be quite a shock for people who are often now in their 50s, 60s or 70s, suddenly taking a DNA test and finding out they're not the person they thought they were. Now, the donor himself does not have to be in the database to be identified. He can be identified through a network of genetic cousins. And there are also some circumstances where the donor conceived person does not have to be in the database. And this can occur if the donor conceived person has children or grandchildren and they take a DNA test. And we have had some examples of someone taking a DNA test and uncovering the fact that their mother or their father was donor conceived and the parent hadn't known. When you take one of these DNA tests, there are two different components to the ancestry side of it. You're given one of these, what they now call ancestral regions, and this really focuses on your more distant ancestry going back about 500 to 1,000 years. But even if you know nothing about who you are or where you're from, this can still provide some useful indications about your ancestry. You have to generally ignore the smaller percentages, but you do get a broader picture. And at Ancestry DNA, they've now able to provide actually quite fine level granularity with another feature called Ancestral Journeys, which looks at networks of people who share large amounts of DNA. And if you get one of these regions, then that gives you a very strong indication of where you have to start looking in your search for your parent. So what you get when you take one of these DNA tests, this is an ancestry screenshot but with the names changed, you get a list of your genetic cousins and you're given the predicted relationship. But for each relationship, there's actually a range of possibilities, but the more you share with someone, the closer the relationship. And most people now, as ancestry, you're getting several thousand matches. Most of them are distant cousins. It's really the closer matches that you tend to want to focus on, the matches that are fourth cousin or closer. And we're also seeing some people who take a DNA test and they're being matched right from the start with a parent. Now, the DNA test can't tell you that it's necessarily your father. If you share 50% of your DNA, it could, you could be matching with a son or daughter, but Ancestry use the ages of the testers and also the gender to try and predict the likely relationship. And probably a more likely scenario for a donor-conceived person taking the DNA test is that they could be matched with other donor siblings who are in the database. Now, a half sibling would share roughly 25% of their DNA in common, but sharing that amount of DNA, there are a number of possible relationships. It could be a aunt-uncle relationship, it could be a half-sibling, or it could be a grandparent-grandchild relationship. But again, the ages and genders are used to try and make the most likely prediction. And of course, there are people who are taking a DNA test who may suddenly find that they end up with this huge long list of potential half siblings in the database. But with DNA testing, we always have to use the additional contextual information to actually work out the actual relationship. So that means doing the genealogy research, working out the person's age, and also all their other relationships. Now, even if you don't get a close match, it is still possible to use DNA to try and identify the father. So the way that we do this is that we look at the genetic matches, we sort them into groups based on shared relationships. So the sweet spot is really round about the second cousin level. If you've got matches with second cousins, then it's generally, well, depending on the matches, it can be a fairly straightforward task to identify the the birth father. So you have a match with a second cousin, you look at the people who match you and the second cousin, and you then start researching the trees of all the people in that group. And then you trace down from that second cousin, you've narrowed it down to a particular quarter of the family tree. You trace that person's descendants. You discover this person has a son called Peter Plum. He was an only child. He then married. He then had another child called Piers Plum. And then we do the same. We have another cluster of matches who are, again, we can identify this particular cluster is from Yorkshire. So we look at the second cousin, we look at all the shared matches. We are able to work out which part of the tree these people are related on. We work out the common ancestor for this particular couple, and then we trace the tree down towards the present day. And we may find that this family had lots and lots of children. So you then have to do lots of descendancy research. You look at all the siblings. But what we're trying to do is finding a link between the two different groups. And we find that one of the children was Ruth, and she then married David. And we discovered David was from Devon. So now we've got a possible link between those two between these two different groups. And we then continue tracing the family forwards, and we find that a Debbie Dillon marries a Piers Plum. So this is our eureka moment where the two different groups have come together, and we're now able to narrow down our search to the children of that couple. And so we've identified, in this case, there were 4 siblings. Now, one important limitation of genetic testing is that it cannot distinguish between siblings. So you would have to test, you'd either have to contact the person, or you'd have to do additional testing unless you can rule out from circumstances and identify that only one person was in the right place at the right time. So that's how you would identify someone without that person being in the database. It does very much depend on who else is in the database, and I would say that it's easier for people with sort of Northwestern European ancestry, and it's much more difficult for people of, say, Eastern European ancestry, and particularly, say, German ancestry, or France doesn't currently allow genetic testing, although that still doesn't stop people taking DNA tests. So what this means in 2025, the short summary is that DNA means that donors are not anonymous. Okay.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thank you. Indeed, many have made the test just to find out from where their ancestors came from, and test results can sometimes could have led to more questions. So this is a very good reminder of that. Thank you so much for this. And when we are talking about donors, we also wonder how many families one donor should help. And here we will have Jackson Kirkman-Brown to talk about this important question. Jackson is internationally recognized for his work in fertility and sperm. As director of the Center for Human Reproductive Science, he leads an interdisciplinary team with clinical trials and basic science collaborations across the UK and globe. Alongside his dual role of Professor of Human Reproductive Science and HFEA person responsible at Birmingham Women's Fertility Centre, Jackson is chair of the Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists. He's currently chief investigator for the NIHR-funded Unexplained Infertility Treatment Trial and was confirmed an MBA for his work in developing the fertility preservation pathway for servicemen with catastrophic genital injury. Jackson has been a vocal proponent for the voices of those born through donor conception and has called for a move towards international family limits for donation. So Jackson, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for Fertility Europe for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. So really, one of the questions that gets addressed less is this question of how many families should we be creating with the same donor? For a bit of background, there is best practice information there on what people should know, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But in terms of how many offspring, Legislation differs across Europe and across the world. And as Debbie and Nina and others have touched on, we have this question of anonymity versus genetic traceability that is now there. I think what I'd like to get everybody to think about today is that our focus is changing somewhat. So a number of decades ago, really a focus at that time was around enabling patient treatment. And we've moved on from just the idea of enabling patient treatment to thinking about donor-conceived offspring and their well-being. So when thinking about information and support, I was privileged to also be an author on the ESHRE best practice guidance. And I'd urge anybody, whether they work in the field or they're a prospective patient, to go away and look at that. It sets down the information that donors should know, that recipients should know, and that's important for donor-conceived offspring. And within that, there are some checklists. These checklists at a high level summarize what that information should be that's provided and what the support should be. I would very strongly say that any patient or donor should get the things on these checklists. And whether you're a provider, a patient, or a donor-conceived offspring, if you're not getting some of the answers on these checklists, then that is a real query about the treatment and about how that's being delivered. Others have touched on it, but really direct-to-consumer genetic testing means genetic anonymity doesn't exist anymore. So irrespective of the rules in the different countries across Europe or elsewhere in the world, individuals will have an ability to potentially trace their donor or donor siblings. And so here I'm just pointing you to the Connected DNA project from the University of Manchester. This is really beginning to look at how people perceive these links and different individuals' reactions to them. I think a key point is that genetics is a personal thing, and every individual understands that in a different way. In the past, when we've talked about donor anonymity or the situation of finding out something about origins, a lot of that involved whether a parent told where this had happened. This is no longer a case. As Debbie said, it's something that people stumble upon. But also usually it has huge amounts of other information, maybe unexpected information, potentially about diseases in the genetically linked family or other such things that an individual often hasn't actually known they were going to end up with or necessarily been looking for. Equally, perceiving things genetically in terms of relationships isn't how society has really worked in terms of our understandings going backwards. And thinking about things in terms of genetic links is also quite complicated. In terms of when we look at donation, there are real questions there about should that just be about a patient or about couple choice? Because the effects are on the offspring. So in the UK, for example, we have a 10 family limit, and I'll shortly touch on limits elsewhere in Europe. But when thinking about why, ideas of individuals meeting a half sibling and trying to start their own family or falling in a relationship indicate you can have potentially hundreds of thousands of donor children before those numbers become relevant. So these really have always had a welfare of the child context, a welfare of the donor-conceived offspring context, and thinking about that. And that is becoming more and more prevalent. If we look in the donation limits across Europe, this map is in a recent ESHRE publication that talks about legislation across the continent. The colours from the light greens are indicating very low numbers through to the dark blue indicating maximum numbers of around 12. And the countries that I've placed yellow at the moment don't have limits. So in effect, could be unlimited by my understanding, although there may be other regulations in place. It's also notable where we can see the couples with a child in yellow on here. Those countries use a family limit, which I would argue for, because certainly a sibling that's a full genetic sibling in a family is something that should be allowed. Some countries are using a limit on a total number of children, which is certainly not the same and can somewhat be a negative experience for parents. But all of those limits only apply in country. So when you look at movement of gametes across a border, every donor could potentially have hundreds of children across Europe. If we just look at the countries where there is a maximum number stated, that would be around 184 donor-conceived offspring, even if none had siblings across Europe. And that's only in the countries with limits. So where we have countries without limits, that's more complicated still. When we look in the UK, HFEA, our regulator, have released a number of figures around things. So you can see the number of cycles and a number of patients have increased since 2008 through to 2021, which is the latest data available. And over that time, more than half of the donors being used in the UK were actually imported. So 27% from the United States, 21% from Denmark. Imported donors directly meaning that they're being exported from those countries and are therefore not subject really to the national limit. Yes, we have a 10 UK family limit, but that's 10 families in the UK. These donors are obviously being used elsewhere, and so there will be other families in those other locations. But we live in a world now, and if you're going to find siblings, the number of donor-conceived siblings is what's relevant. They may have different language, they may have different culture, but all of this will be relevant. And with direct-to-consumer genetic testing, because that's global, those are the numbers that you will find. It's probably of less relevance whether they're local. And certainly when we look in the scenario of an international border, that international border is the least relevant thing when you're finding siblings. If we just look at train travel in Europe, if you're donor conceived and in London, you can get to meet a donor conceived fellow in Brussels or Paris far more rapidly than you could a donor conceived sibling who was in the north of Scotland. Yet the UK is one location and Brussels and Paris are in two other totally different geographies with different rules. As we come into Europe and look at the borders across Europe, then that clearly becomes even more ridiculous when we think of applying limits where somebody can be just a few miles away in a different country and a donor sibling that would way exceed the limits. So that really does call for an international quota. It's nearly 10 years ago that I was first involved in the paper on this, where we had a cross-European team who tried to look at minimum standards and what an international sperm donor quota would look like. And I say sperm donor because it's very unlikely that from one egg donor at the moment we would ever generate these large family numbers. So now there is this global market for sperm. We need to realize that not every provider is equal. Some will have a limit. The usually lowest limits we find start from about 40 families if they're groups that are exporting sperm, up to having no limit at all. or no meaningful limit. So we need better data, and whether it's providers or recipient patients, whilst we're unsure, we need to look at less risk of psychological harm to the offspring. We know that in these very large family groups, there are many individuals who find it a negative experience finding too many donor-conceived siblings. So this does mean that we need limits to donor offspring numbers, because a few individuals having a very positive experience of it does not outweigh the numbers having a very negative experience. That means international leaders need to start to take a position on this, and that's to protect everyone. These police family limits really do need to be international, or at the very least, pan-European. And we can't just ignore the needs of thousands of children a year who are being born through these treatments to satisfy the perceived needs of potential parents. There are many arguments that we hear around, well, it's important that the parent gets sufficient choice. In actually that donor-conceived offspring's case, they're not having the choice about whether they have hundreds of siblings. And when much of the data reflects that's a problem for donor-conceived offspring who exist now, we need to begin to put these limits in place to protect those in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackson, for talking about this perspective of gamete donations and donors. As with many other issues in the field of human reproduction, we really need to have clear rules and positions on these issues. Ignoring or closing our eyes is not the right solution. I totally agree. So next, we will hear, and I will show you who is going to be next. We will hear two presentations from the patient's perspective. First, Maciej is going to talk about being a father of two donor-conceived children. Since 2016, he has been a member of the Association for Infertility Treatment and Adoption Support, our STALK, based in Warsaw, Poland. And since 2022, he has also been the secretary of the Executive Committee of Fertility Europe. Since late 2022, he has participated in the works of the ESHRE Ethics Committee as a representative of Fertility Europe and through Fertility Europe in fertility patients. Having traveled his own fertility journey, he is a father of twins conceived with donor sperm. So let's hear your story, Maciej. Can you share your screen?
Hello, Satu.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I'm ready to share my screen now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's hope this works. Can you see my presentation?
Looks very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Satu, for your kind introduction. And the title of my today's talk is The Child in the Spotlight, Being an Intentional and Actual Parent Through Donation. And as opposed to the previous speakers which talked about facts, I'm going to focus more on emotions in my talk. So, as you already know, there are many routes to non-genetic parenthood. There may be a diagnosis of infertility in a couple with impaired genetic material in at least one of the partners. There may be people that are forced to face the necessity to take the infertility treatment at a later age, which means after 45, when the chances for success with own gametes are meager. And there may be social infertility in single women, same-sex couples, etc. So today I'm going to focus on the first group because this is my own personal experience as well. So this route to the non-genetic parenthood is actually a long and winding road for each of us recipient parents. First, there's intentional parenthood, when the couple decides we want a kid. And then this is met with failed expectations, so there is simply no pregnancy. And we receive initial diagnosis of infertility. So at least we know that something is wrong. And we are offered some choices for treatment, which may be assisted reproductive technology, which may be something less invasive. But anyway, it fails as well, because there is an underlying deeper problem. And then, when we are diagnosed more thoroughly, we receive the morbid diagnosis of poor gametes or no gametes, or some other obstacle to have your own genetic kids. And then there's the period of grief after this intentional child that we already had and we wanted to have, because it is impossible for us to have our own child no more. And then may come the decision to use the donor material to establish our own family. So a lot of people express consent to this. The donor may say, I consent to my genetic material being used by others, by possibly unknown people, to conceive children that will not be mine in any sense, outside this genetic connection. And the recipient may say, I consent to having embryos conceived with the genetic material of an outsider, and accepting the possible children as legally my own. But then there is the third party, the child, and may say, I wasn't really asked for consent. Now you may think that that's really not different from a spontaneous conception. Actually, none of us consented to being born, but that's a very different special situation where introducing the child to the world in a very specific configuration of genetic and non-genetic parenthood. So we, the parents, have lots of emotions. We have grief after this intentional child that we can no longer have. We have hopelessness in the face of lots and lots of failed treatments. Sometimes we feel the pressure and urgency to use the donor material because we feel the ticking of the biological clock. Then there is hope that this new treatment will finally result in pregnancy and the child that we want so badly. Then there is concern if the pregnancy goes well and everything is fine. And then relief when the child is born. And when the child is born comes responsibility. A non-genetic parent is just like a genetic parent. He or she has to take care of the child. But in this aspect, taking care of the child also means telling the child about his or her genetic provenance. And this may lead to new relief when there is no mystery and we reintegrate all our feelings and we make our family stronger. And it goes in parallel with child emotions. The child may feel the secrecy around it. If we don't tell the child that he or she is donor conceived. The children are naturally curious, particularly when they see that there is some secret involved in the way that they have come, that they have arrived in this world. And then, when they learn, there is astonishment and shock. Shock particularly if they learn an accident. But even if they learn on purpose, even if we decide to tell the children that they are donor conceived, they must still experience shock, which may lead to identity loss, because the child no longer knows what is true and what are the basics of the being in this world for he or she. And then there may be anger. I'm angry because nobody told me, or I'm angry because I was not asked for consent to being born this way. But hopefully, finally, like for parents, there is reintegration, when everything clicks and we can overcome all the obstacles. And the policy here is children first. we as the parents tend to think about all the things on the left, which is the treatment, the pregnancy, the dangers connected with all of this, the failures that were on the way, and then the kid rising. But we need to think of the child first. And this is nicely summarized in the introduction to the Human Assisted Reproductive Technology Act from New Zealand, for example. The health and well-being of children born as a result of the performance of an assisted reproductive procedure or an established procedure should be an important consideration in all decisions about that procedure, which means the child comes first. So what are the basic do's and don'ts of donor conception? Donor conception is not a Vanity Fair. Do not look for designer babies. Look for your own babies that you feel are your own truly. And do not keep secrecy. Eventually, someone always knows, and it's good that the child learns from you and not from outsiders. And overall, keep the atmosphere of openness and trust in your family. But there are things you can help, and there's this anonymous donation. So, as we have learned previously in this webinar, still many of the European countries allow only anonymous donation. This is also the situation in Poland, so I do not know the identity of the donor, neither my children. But there is this other thing you can't help, but that's a good thing, because due to public ancestry services, as we have learned just several minutes ago, your child can learn about half-siblings everywhere across the world. And thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you so much, Maciej. I'm sorry, I was struggling with the video. Thank you so much for this open and honest presentation and perspective. It's always a pleasure to hear the patient's voice. And just a reminder to our audience that you can put your questions to the Q&A section below at the end of the screen, on bottom of the screen, if you have any questions to our speakers. And next, we will hear more patient perspective when our last speaker, Monica from Fertility Europe, is going to share with us her presentation. She's presenting some of our patient survey results. I am sure that in the audience of this webinar, we have people who have participated in the survey during this autumn and are eager to hear the results. So Monica, please tell us what you found out.
Thank you, Satu, and thank you to Fertility Europe for giving me the opportunity to present the preliminary results of the gamete donation patient survey. So the survey was first published in June 2024. It will be running until the end of this year, so the final report will be ready after that. The data that I'm presenting today is accurate as of the end of October 2024. A few numbers behind the survey. So we had 1,550 complete responses, 34 countries and territories covered, 89% of the respondents were female, and 66% of the respondents considered or had gamete donation treatment. I think that you should meet this lady. This lady comes from Romania, and she's a lady, as a vast majority of our participants. And the reason I think you need to meet her is because her presence is quite heavy in the survey. Nearly a quarter, 23% of all responses come from Romania. Before I go any further, I would like to make two disclaimers, actually. One is that the figures I'm going to present
are sometimes only limited to a yes answer, but please bear in mind that there are also other answers like no, somewhat, I don't know, I have no preference, and such. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will just focus on those areas that are especially important for the patients. And the second disclaimer is that whenever I quote any patient's statements that just for illustration purposes, they haven't been analyzed yet when it comes to prevalence of specific positions of the papers. So that is something yet to be dealt with. Today, I'm going to talk about 5 selected areas. This is information, implication counseling, psychological support, accessibility here in terms of cross-border care, and fair practice, where I will talk a bit about anonymity of donors. So information, when it comes to information, there are 2 main areas. One is information available in the public domain. And here we see that only 11% of patients find this information accurate and sufficient. While it comes to fertility clinics and the information they provide to the patients, the numbers look slightly better. 35% were informed about the possibility of undergoing gamete donation treatment when discussing all available treatment options. However, only 20% of them found this information sufficient. Implication counseling, this is an extremely important thing to have because this allows for a proper informed decision-making on one hand, and also to fully understand long-term ramifications of gamete donation. So it's really important aspect of all sorts of fertility treatment, but I think in particular gamete donation treatment. It is not defined consistently across Europe, it is not standardized, and it is not compulsory to offer it to the patients, unfortunately. Thus, only 16% of patients who were provided implication counseling found it adequate. At the same time, let's move for a while to Spain. As we all know, Spain is a big destination for gamete donation treatment, and only in 2019, nearly 43% of all egg donation treatments took place in Spain. This is data that was retrieved from ESHRE report on in vitro performance in Europe. That's quite a daunting number, I think, bearing in mind those numbers. Then psychological support. This is a subject that we covered thoroughly during the last year's European Fertility Week. We identified the patient's needs, and we identified the actual offer of these sort of services. As a result, we identified as well a massive gap that is in between. And here you can find the confirmation of that, as well as only 14% of patients were offered psychological support around the gamete donation treatment. The next aspect is cross-border care. This is what I've mentioned is quite a big occurrence when it comes to fertility treatments in general, but especially when it comes to gamete donation treatments. So some people, if the world was ideal, would be able to have that treatment in a local clinic that offers a good patient care and services, and they would remain in the comfort of their own home. So home sweet home it is, and the reasons behind it are simple logistics. As you can imagine, it's easier, it's cheaper, and there is no language barriers to have treatment in your home country. And this reason is, I would say, patient-centered, but the following ones, like the same culture heritage, sense of belonging, the same language, and geographical proximity, is actually something that is related to the resulting children. As intended parents often bear in mind that it would be better for the children to understand the same culture code, to speak the same language, and not having to travel far whenever they want to meet their donor. There is another end of that spectrum, and there are patients that say that the place absolutely don't matter when there is a possibility of having treatment. And this is something that takes us to the reasoning behind it. Anita covered that pretty much, so you know that there is limited availability, and affordability is a factor as well. Different regulations and ethical approach as well varies across Europe. But interestingly enough, geographical proximity was also mentioned among those group of patients that would rather travel to have treatment. And this is also because of the perspective of the resulting child. However, the context is completely different, because those group of parents would like to lower the probability of coming across a donor, especially when the child might not be prepared for that or not even willing to meet that donor. So these are the numbers that illustrate the preference among the patients, whether they have it done at home or whether travel to have their treatment. And the last aspect I would like to talk about today is donor anonymity in gamete donation. This is a massive subject. This is a very sensitive subject. This is also a very hot subject, as we learned today, and probably also a very divisive subject. Here you can see the quotes that represent probably two different worlds of those who would be as transparent as possible and those who are not ready for that yet, and for various reasons, I believe. Here are the results of the survey. You can see the numbers, and you can see that anonymous donation is doing quite strong, and that ID release donation and known donation together taken are actually preferred by a high number of patients that anonymous donation. That made me think that since you know that Romanian lady was so heavily present in this survey, I would really like to know what she thinks about gamete donation in terms of donor's ID. And this is what she thinks. This is what her preference would be. That again made me think, oh, does it really matter where you come from? And does it really influence your views so much? So I divided the countries into two groups. The first group is the countries allowing for strictly anonymous donation. And the other group is the countries allowing exclusively for ID release donation. As you may see, there is no Romania here because it didn't fall in any of the groups. The regulations are just too complicated. And here are the results. And I think they're quite astonishing because when you look at them, you see that they actually make like a positive and negative of the same image almost. So yes, it does most probably where we live, and it does influence our decisions. Since you met the Romanian lady, I think I would like you to meet another lady, and this lady is a Dutch lady. So the Dutch lady is here because I thought I would like to mention the Netherlands once again. I know Debbie touched on the problem that was discovered in the Netherlands, that mass donor scandal probably shook the country quite massively. But the positive outcome of that is that it looks that the Dutch do it right. They sort of like, they did their homework. They sort of like had the public debate, and they came up with the regulations that, as you can see here, marry two worlds. On one hand, they observe the rights of donor-conceived children that, as Mati said, had no say about their conception, origin, and so on. And on the other hand, it is so broadly accepted by the patients. I think it's extremely important to appreciate it, because we know that politicians and policymakers are very often tempted to grab just that low-hanging fruit and just ban whatever goes wrong, just ban it and turn the blind eye that, you know, it's happening anyway, and just conveniently assume that it is not. We know it does, so that's why it's so important to regulate it in the right way. And to find that patients' acceptance for the policy that are implemented. As far as I'm concerned, I would like to see a little bit of more of Netherlands across Europe. I would like to take the opportunity and thank to Mariana Susalete from Cardiff University, who offered her help and advice on how to deal with the data. And whenever I wasn't fully capable of following her advice, I take the sole responsibility for it. And I would also like to thank all of you for listening and for learning about patients' perspective on gamete donation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. We will carry out further analyses based on the survey, and they will be published on Fertility Europe's website later on. Now it is time for your questions and our speakers to answer them. We have quite a few questions here, so what if I just start with the one to Debbie and/or Jackson? So could you please all open your videos, Maciej and Anita, and be ready. And whoever wants to add anything or comment anything, then just please do. So, question to Debbie and/or Jackson. I come from a small country, a few million inhabitants. How long does it take until this DNA testing and donor treatments become a health problem in our country?
Shall I take that one? So I presume that the issue there is concern about two people having a relationship and finding out that they're perhaps half siblings. So it's something that's very difficult to quantify, but I would suggest that in any small country like that, it would be a good idea for anyone who's donor conceived to always take a consumer DNA test before entering into any sort of relationship or before thinking of having a family. I know in Iceland they do actually have an app because it's a small country with where it's only fairly recently populated, and you can actually check on this app how closely you're related to your intended partner, though of course you need to have the genealogy information available in the first place.
I guess what I'd pop in there is we need to remember that statistically, if we look at it, if you're in a country where there is a donor family limit, people are much more likely to meet a half sibling through the infidelities of the parent than they are through donor conception. And
that's a good point.
So in the countries with family limits or conception limits, the chances that you meet somebody who is a donor conceived sibling, although we know that stories of that happen, are infinitesimally small versus being related to somebody usually because you share the same father who had multiple relationships with ladies in the same town or same village. And that is far, far, far more common. So although I don't disagree with Debbie that people should check, and if you're in a country with a register, you can also check the register. We also have to contextualize that actually natural conception bears the same risk at a higher level if you're dating somebody from the same town, city, village of a reasonable size, and that happens at a far higher rate. So it's important we don't scandalize donor conception in a way that people often quote it as this chance of the person you meet being a half sibling, and really that's not the big risk there. I can see Nina might have something to say as well, because I can see Nina smiling.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the infidelity option.
Yes, one thing I would add, that if you are in a country with a very small population, the chances are that you will be closely related to your future partner anyway. You could be related as, say, a second cousin or a third cousin. So it may, although there's not generally any health risk in having that close relationship throughout human history, people have been marrying their second cousins and their third cousins. It's simply the way that the human population has developed.
Yes, very, very good answers. Thank you so much. And this infidelity issue is something that I hadn't thought about either. So thanks for bringing that up. Actually, we have a question to Nina. When is the best age to tell a child that they are donor conceived? Will they be confused if I tell them too young?
Ah, what a great question. So I think there isn't a one size fits all for all families. We would recommend telling a child from as early as parents feel comfortable, and to try and make that as early as possible. And that's really more for the parents than the child. You know, if you're talking about a baby or a toddler, they won't really understand anything that you're telling them. And so talking with a child that young is more about helping parents develop a story and feel confident in the words they're using, and feel confident in how they're going to talk about this before the child understands, so that by the time you've got maybe an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old who will get what the story means and perhaps will ask a question, even perhaps an awkward question, you've already built that foundation, and you've built up your own confidence in the vocabulary and how you're going to explain it. So I think that's the sort of strategy that we would take. In terms of confusion, yeah, I think we just have to keep everything age appropriate and not give too much information. So what we're talking about with young children is really just planting some tiny little seeds that you can then pick up on later on as children grow up, or as you feel that it's appropriate, or as a question comes, or, you know, something, I don't know, a family member gets pregnant and there's a nice hook to talk about pregnancy and how babies are made, and integrated into that might be a conversation, well, you were made in a slightly different way, or however. So yeah, you definitely don't want to go faster than you think your child can cope with, and that should mean that they're not confused, and that if they are confused, that you, or, you know, if they ask a question later on that makes it clear they haven't really understood, then you have that opportunity to clarify at that point and make sure that they do understand. But having said that, it's not a one size fits all. That's what we'd recommend. And that's really because I think it works best for parents, and it generally works best for families. But we also support people who've got much older children, adult children who haven't been told, and it can be done well at any age. So, you know, you haven't missed the boat if you've got an older child, but yeah, and lots of support available.
Yeah, that's true. I have to mention that we had these patient testimonials this week we have been releasing, and there was Emma from Denmark who showed in her video that her parents had made a kind of album or a folder about her donor conceived background, and she felt that that was a really nice way to kind of build her story from the beginning, and she probably used it when she was a child and she still loved it. So that's one good solution. We also have another question to you, Nina. How to convince people who had anonymous donation to tell their children? That's a big question.
Well, I don't want to convince somebody if they're, you know, if they're resolutely of an opinion. I think I would just put forward the arguments I put in the presentation, really. I think that it for people who don't want to tell, whether they've got an ID release donor or an anonymous donor, there's got to be a conversation around what feels so, why would you not tell? What is it that's holding you back? What are your fears around that process? And that can take a lot of time to really unpick that and work out what it is, and to get people to a point where they can even consider, could they be open? And what might that look like? So I don't think I want to convince them exactly. All I perhaps would say is, going back to the slide in my presentation about why it's important, I don't know where this person is in their journey. They may have young children, they may not have had children yet, they may have older children, I don't know. But it, like I said, it can be really tricky to hold that secret forever, literally forever. And a child who discovers later on, as Debbie knows, with some of the people I know that have approached her when they're doing their DNA tests and finding something that doesn't quite match, and they're thinking, why doesn't it match? What am I expecting? And then there can be a sense of, well, why did nobody tell me? And why have my parents kept this a secret from me? And that doesn't feel quite right, I think. And that wouldn't feel quite right to the parent of that child. Like, would you want your child to find this information out and then be worried about you, that you don't know that they know? That, you know, as a parent, to maybe think, would that really feel okay to you? I would think that most parents would feel quite uncomfortable about that scenario as well. So it's balancing everything, and certainly don't want to put pressure on people to do things before they're ready. There are lots, you know, I would definitely say, you know, if it's even something that you're open to come and have a conversation with us. And there are resources and services that we can offer that are specifically around helping people that really struggle with the idea of being open. But yeah, have a look at that first slide that I presented about why it's important, and just reflect on some of those things, really.
Yes, great, thank you. And we will be sharing the slides afterwards, so everybody can see. There is a question to... Jackson, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say, I think it comes back to the thing that maybe various ones of us have said, but it is probably worth re-saying, that you can say unfortunately or fortunately, depending on a perspective, but really a few years ago, I can remember people traveling to different countries in Europe to get anonymous donation, and they felt they were doing something that protected them and their child, and that it meant they need never reveal it. The direct consumer genetic testing has kind of blown that out of the water as a concept. So very often it's not something that as a parent you will have choice in whether somebody finds out. Really, it can be that parents are making a decision between them having control of the information giving, or the chance that somebody else will have control of that information coming out without them being able to control it. And, you know, I've known of cases actually of students within my university where they found these things out because, you know, a 23andMe genetic test seems like a fun thing that you give as a present. And that didn't involve anything to do with parents. That was a house full of people doing them and thinking they were doing something exciting. And so, although whilst a child is young, parents may be able to control this information. In the modern world, actually, as children grow up, they act as free individuals. And if they're finding these things in an uncontrolled situation, then that's very complicated. And that's sort of where Debbie's work and that of others to highlight that and the support that Nina's team can give to people to think round it matters. But the idea that you can always control what this individual will do once they're an adult and they'll be stopped from ever finding it is very flawed.
Yes, I would just add just a few words on that. So I've dealt with some people who've made these discoveries, and in fact, what they find most difficult to deal with is the fact that the parents who brought them up have lied to them, and it's the deception and the lies that they and sometimes that causes a complete breakdown in the relationship. It's not the fact of being donor conceived, it's not being told. And we see this also with, you know, adoption cases, particularly in America, where they don't, a lot of the birth records are restricted, and people find out later on in life through DNA testing. So that is, you know, sometimes the parents are in denial, and they try and they don't believe the results of the genetic tests, and then the child just then stops talking to the mother, who's always generally the one who's most affected in these situations.
I'd just like to say as well that when this charity was founded, all the donors were anonymous, and there's no prospect of that changing. So those principles of honesty and openness and the information being important were foundational. They weren't sort of add-ons after the fact. And I'd say, you know, in our organization, we have like lots and lots of members who have anonymous donors, whether that's because they're historic or they've gone abroad. And so the principles are the same, regardless of what kind of donor you've used.
And then we have a few questions to Maciej. So one is, what would be the one thing you would say to a man who is considering and or hesitating with his wife to use donor sperm?
Wow, that's a delicate question.
Only one thing. No.
I would say don't be afraid, and don't think about the reactions of other people. Think about the creation of your own family.
We have another question for you. How would you support your children if they ever wanted to find the identity of the donor?
I would certainly support them. I would actually like them to find the identity of their donor. I don't know if it's ever possible, but I would support them in every possible way if they wish so.
Thank you. And question to Jackson. What are the ways of following donor limits in the context of anonymity? Is there a way to check that the same donor donated to several clinics in several countries?
So several clinics in several countries, no, there isn't a way to check at the moment. But probably the bigger worry is the way that gametes are shipped around, because that's a very realistic thing. So that's donating at one clinic, and then that clinic selling sperm across borders to different things. So within what I was saying, you can very rapidly say, oh, there's over 200 children. And at that stage, many of those donor conceived offspring will have negative experience of that large group. All the data says that will happen. And so I think this is where, in the absence of legislation, if you look at the ESHRA guidelines, we have written in there that patients have a right to know the duration and use and family limits for that donor. So you can ask for the clinic that's treating you or the provider of the sperm to tell you the absolute limits that they have applied to that donor. And there are providers now across Europe and the world who will give you those limits and that undertaking. The number of donors that would then be traveling elsewhere to do it across borders to really pump the numbers up or something are probably limited, because in most scenarios the compensation isn't huge. And so the situation of at least trying to take control is having that information yourself when you're doing it. And I think it touches up maybe on some of the previous question. It's actually understanding what you're picking when you pick a donor, because yes, you can pick to try and match some characteristics, maybe skin color and things like that. But in the end, each of us gets half our information from a genetic parent. So half of it's been totally thrown away. That could be the good part, It doesn't guarantee you getting the 50% of your the sperm producers' genes that were amazing. You could be getting the 50% that were rubbish, and you might get more of the lethal genes, because we've all got a few lethal genes, and then they're matched up against 50% of somebody else. And whether that's good genetic or bad genetic characteristics, we can't tell. So really it's the same as playing a lottery machine or something in terms of what those genetics will do. The one thing that we're always sure of is that the epigenetics are very important. So the things going on while mum carries that child are very important. And the things around that child early in life are very, very important. And those are the things that are going to turn that child into an individual. So whether it's telling them about their donor conceived origin, or it's actually about the health of their own children if they go on to have genetic children of their own, those things are actually set down by lots of things during pregnancy and early upbringing. And so the idea that this person who donated a gamete, yes, they did something very significant in enabling a family, but the idea that there is a piece of genetics there that we can trace back that's super important. The only time it's going to be incredibly important is probably if it's actually a genetic disease that's lethal. Otherwise, it's unlikely that we ever pinpoint a few genes and go, these are super important in making this person who they are. And so just because we can test all these things, we kind of maybe give them too much importance in what they mean.
And then maybe one question to all of you or any one of you, are there regulations in any country when or if the parents want to test their child's DNA? And this is probably about a minor.
So the direct consumer genetic tests often say you've got to be an adult to take them. And usually, unless there is a genetic risk to a child in most countries, best practice guidance says you don't test a child unless it's going to be something that's specifically a condition where you're going to treat it for it before it's an adult. So it should be its choice as an adult. What we do know is that in all these scenarios, there is very little control of that. So that there are many people who've got donor-conceived children who've swabbed the child as a baby because all you've got to do is send a bit of saliva and send that away to test. They are breaking the rules of what the system says, but because the system isn't a healthcare professional being involved, the system is a post-away test, there is no control over that.
Right. I would add that effectively this is decided by the terms and conditions of the companies. So you are potentially breaching their terms and conditions if they catch you out. But I think I did look into this in the past. I think it's only family tree DNA that specifically say you should not test a child under 13. The other companies say you can do so with parental consent. There are technical barriers to testing a child at 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, because you have, rather than using a cheek swab, you have to physically spit into a little vial and you have to produce quite a lot of spit. So you obviously can't get a baby to spit into a vial, but even so, if you go to YouTube, you will find that there are videos that tell you how you can produce artificial saliva, and then you can do a cheek swab, and then you can send that that sample off to Ancestry DNA or 23andMe to get your child into the databases. And I'm not aware of anyone actually being prosecuted or by the companies for breaching the terms and conditions. It's something that'd be very, very difficult to actually check.
Yeah. Well, then there's a question to Monica. Where would you start changing patients' perspective on anonymity?
Oh,
a very easy one.
Very difficult question. As I mentioned, these results are not final yet, and there are lots of qualitative questions as well, and are pretty much elaborate by the patients. But from what I have seen so far and what I have read so far, I can tell that there is a lot of fear behind those decisions about not telling. And I think that probably links to what Nina said, that the parents' own insecurities very often determine their decisions about whether to tell, whether to be honest with their children or not. So I think that basically what we do here even is just a step towards, encouraging people to be honest with their loved ones, because at the end of the day, this is what it matters. You love somebody, you want them to trust you, and you want them to be happy and potentially not expose them to any difficult situation in life. So yeah, I think I would emphasize that sort of like positive outcome of that. And I think we've got lots of testimonials about it. As Satu mentioned, we've got 2 testimonials of donor-conceived children being posted on our social media during the European Fertility Week. But we also have a massive speech of Timo Ramu, who was our speaker during patient session this year at the ESHRE Congress. And he really, I think, should at least probably be able to convince many people that it is much better to be open and honest, because he's one of those people who learned being adult by total coincidence that he was donor conceived. And there was a very detrimental experience, not so much being donor conceived, that it was told here already, but about the fact that his family, his loved ones, his near and dear were not really honest with him. So, yeah. I'm not a specialist, I have to say. It's just my gut feeling and what I learned from you here today as well.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question to Jackson, because this is so interesting question. Is the attraction in a romantic meaning really present among people who are genetically related, although they don't know that?
I think that's an impossible question to answer.
Again.
There aren't really very many studies on this, because it's something that happens very rarely by chance, and like I said, is more likely outside regulated donation than actually with inside assisted reproduction. But I think if we had somebody here speaking on science, what they would say is people tend to like a certain type of people. So many people are attracted to a very certain thing, and that certain set of things that an individual likes. I've not seen anything that says you're more likely to hunt out and find your sibling. I think it's actually probably the reverse. But because when these things happen, they cause big stories, we're usually much more reactive to those stories. And as humans, we do coincidence detection. So when we hear about these things happening, then they become the big story that makes people think there must be a huge risk that happens a lot. Whereas really they're things that happen once in a blue moon. As I said, in terms of, I work alongside a regional genetics lab. In terms of genetics disease, and when we see these things crop up, actually it's far more common amongst people who wouldn't know at all. It's not from donation. So I think realistically, no, there's no evidence that if you've got a half sibling, be it through donation or anything else, that you're suddenly going to find them more attractive. But I don't know whether Debbie knows any other studies on that.
Yes, I would actually add something on this, because this is something that has been known from the adoption industry, where and there is actually a known phenomenon called genetic sexual attraction, and there are papers on this subject. It's not something I know a great deal about, but it is definitely a known phenomenon that when people meet later on in life, you do have that attraction to somebody who looks like you. I can't remember the names of any of the papers offhand, but I may be able to find out. But there certainly has been research in the adoption field in that area, and it is potentially also an issue in donor conception.
Interesting field, that one too. Okay, I think it's time to thank yous. We are already almost 15 minutes over time, but thank you so much for bearing with us. So thank you to our wonderful speakers for the time and effort you put on this webinar for the benefit of fertility patients. Thank you so much. Your dedication is highly appreciated. Thank you to all of you who have joined the webinar. I hope you have learned more about these important issues and that you got answers to your questions. All the presentations will be available for you on our website later, and this webinar will be available on our Fertility Europe YouTube channel. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.